So I'm Gil Van Bokkelen, and with me is Michael Werner. And what we're going to do over the next few minutes is actually explore one of the topics that Tom was mentioning, which is the interface between the improvements in the regulatory front and what should be happening actually on the reimbursement front. Now, I would love to spend 25 minutes talking to you about all the exciting things we're doing at Athersys in terms of developing multi-stem or off-the-shelf allogeneic cell therapy product, but that wasn't the charge I was given today. So we're going to focus on some other things that are not related to that. For any of you that are interested in what we're doing at Athersys, please come grab me or Dr. Bob Deans, who's sitting in the back, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it offline. Now, as Tom was mentioning, there's a team of us, not just Michael and me, but actually a much larger group that represent the community of regenerative medicine through the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine that are working together to try and affect changes that we think will benefit the entire field. And it's because of our passionate belief that this is a transformational area of medical technology. Is going to help a lot of patients that right now, frankly, have no hope and no real effective treatment options. The reality of it is that one of the reasons why I love this event is because it gives us an opportunity to not just hear about some of the progress that's being made by various companies and the like, but to really talk about issues that are central to all of us in the field. And it provides us an opportunity to discuss, debate, sometimes argue, usually over drinks, about what the issues are and how we can attack them in a more effective way. So Michael and I are going to try and advance a couple of important issues forward in the next few minutes that relate to this interface between reimbursement and regulatory approval. Now, we've heard over and over again from presentations yesterday and presentations that will be occurring throughout the conference that there are a number of central challenges that we all face that really relate to and frankly impede the development of these amazing technologies and these new therapeutic modalities that are being developed across a number of different fronts. And certainly I'm not going to rehash all of the challenges here, but what we're really going to focus on today is the interface between these two things, regulatory process complexities and corresponding reimbursement challenges. And the reality of it is that there's some really exciting things happening, which we'll show you evidence of in terms of improvements in the regulatory process side of things, but we're really not paying enough attention to what's going on the reimbursement side of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the changes that are happening on the regulatory front. I'm then going to turn it over to Michael, who's going to talk about some of the corresponding challenges on the reimbursement front, and then we're going to try and tie the whole things together. One of the key points that I'd like to make just to start off is these two things should operate in sync, or at least more in sync. They can't be done exactly at the same time. They're really not being pursued in most instances in any kind of synchronized manner, and that's really a problem, and I think you'll understand why by the end of the presentation. There have been some very exciting advances on the regulatory front just in the last year, and frankly just in the last few weeks, and I'll give you some examples of that. I think as most of you know, last July some very important legislation went into effect in the United States, FDASIA or FDASIA, depending on how you like to pronounce it, which was also tied to the renewal of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA 5, which was signed into legislation last July. I think it was July 7th or thereabouts. There was a number of things that we as the Alliance, working with our colleagues at Bio and other organizations, really fought hard for on the regulatory front. I think we all here appreciate the fact that clinical trials, as Tom was just mentioning, they can take a really long time, they can cost an enormous amount of money, and frankly, most of the innovators that are working in the field of regenerative medicine don't have the time and don't have the capital resources to be able to do what we'd like to do if you play by kind of the conventional rules. Nor do I think it should always be required that we have to do that. So we fought for some new regulatory initiatives that might make it easier and faster to get some of these new therapies developed and ultimately approved by the FDA and then into the hands of clinicians and into patients where they can make a difference. And two of the great success stories that we were able to achieve there were the broadening of the accelerated approval framework. I think most of you, and I'll talk a little bit more about the history of this in just a minute, but that was a very important initiative, but also the creation of a new designation, something called the Breakthrough Therapies Framework. And I'm going to talk about both of those in a little bit more detail in a minute. The ultimate impact here is that we've created mechanisms that now will allow us to work with the FDA and other regulatory agencies, because I think this thinking is now actually being implemented by other regulatory agencies around the world, Japan actually being a really good example with some recent announcements that they just made, that could create shorter, more efficient clinical pathways so that we can actually get these products approved. But a key question begins to emerge as you think about this. What happens if we're actually getting these new therapies through the clinical and regulatory process faster and more efficiently, if we don't make changes in the reimbursement landscape. We could actually get things approved and then not have a way to pay for them. And perhaps this is a serious issue, not the least of which is because some of these therapies are likely to be very expensive, and if you don't have a corresponding reimbursement framework, there's literally no way to actually see them implemented clinically, at least in any sort of meaningful way. So it's critically important that we as a field begin to pay attention to this issue, and that we also think as individual entities about the interface between the regulatory process and the reimbursement paradigm that exists, or the issues related to reimbursement, so that we can begin to attack them in an effective way. Now, for those of you that are not so familiar with the history of accelerated approval, this framework actually went into effect back in 1992. It was driven in large part by patient advocacy. It started with groups that were very concerned about the HIV epidemic and what the impact was having there. It also related to an urgent need in various areas of oncology. And so the FDA ultimately agreed to rethink how they measure, if you will, clinical relevance by allowing for the first time the use of surrogate endpoints as opposed to long-term endpoints like impact on survival or some of the other things that might take a very, very long time to measure. And by the time you could actually complete clinical trials to quantify those effects, many of the people that were afflicted with the disease would have died. So the FDA said, we're going to think about this differently. We're going to implement some new rules. We're going to create paradigms that will allow us to shorten the time frame, if you will, and shorten the process for some of these therapies that are focused on addressing significant areas of unmet medical need. And that's how this first went into effect. But historically, for 20 years, this was essentially applied only for very narrowly defined set of conditions, things like AIDS or things like certain indications in the oncology area. And there was a growing sense that, hey, those aren't the only urgent clinical needs that we face. There are many, many more things that we can and should be applying this type of thinking towards. And so as part of this legislation that went into effect last summer, the FDA explicitly agreed for the first time that, yes, we're actually going to broaden the application of the accelerated approval pathway into some other areas to actually enable a dramatic compression in terms of development of these clinical opportunities, specifically for things that are focused on significant unmet medical needs. But there's a couple of points that I'd like to make here. Actually, can you use this pointer? Because this one. So the first is that this can shorten the time, but it's going to be data-driven, and the approval of the endpoints has to be scientifically based. Okay, so there is a scientific rigor that is required here in terms of being able to demonstrate what is going on here, and it doesn't alleviate the need to conduct adequate and well-controlled studies. Okay, but again, it's a very exciting step forward because it means we can begin to think about this in a broader sense. Breakthrough therapies, I think, could be even more impactful because what this does is this allows us to shorten the clinical and regulatory process even further. But there's a few things that should specifically be borne in mind when you're thinking about the application of this. So the first thing is that you actually have to request it. Okay, the FDA isn't going to say, hey, yeah, we were really impressed with your data, therefore we think that you should be given breakthrough therapy status. You actually have to file a formal application to explain to the FDA why you think you should be given breakthrough status. The explicit objective of this is to expedite the development and the review. So that has ramifications both in terms of the review process, but also in the clinical process, the overall clinical process of itself. The third thing is that it's focused on enhancing the development of serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions, and it's got to be evidence-based. It's got to be based on clinical evidence that demonstrates a robust effect, substantial improvement over existing standard of care. Okay? So again, it has to be done in a way that actually is focused on clinically significant endpoints. So again, just to summarize, you have to request it. The FDA has a statutorily defined 60-day time frame to actually review the request and get back to you. So it's actually done in an efficient way. The emphasis is on serious or life-threatening conditions. And it's a data-driven process and ultimately a data-driven determination as to what will actually be given breakthrough therapy status. Now, the other thing that I should point out is that as part of the legislation, the FDA was given 18 months to define exactly how this is going to work. Okay? But what they also built into the legislation was a mechanism for moving things forward within that 18-month time frame. And as you'll see in a minute, there are a number of things that just within the past 3 weeks have actually been granted breakthrough therapy status by the FDA. In fact, I think there's about 7 or 8 distinct examples. I'll show you a handful of them in just a minute. So what are the benefits going to be of breakthrough therapy status? Well, some of the things are fairly predictable. It means you get to interact with the FDA a little bit more often than you might otherwise be allowed to do using kind of the standard traditional framework. But I think really what it comes down to is redefining what the clinical path is going to look like. It creates an explicit pathway, an explicit mechanism that will allow you to run shorter, smaller clinical trials and fewer clinical trials in order to demonstrate a robust clinical effect and then ultimately get breakthrough therapy designation. Now, there is a corresponding requirement to this. If you actually go through the accelerated approval pathway or you go through the breakthrough therapies pathway, you are going to be required to conduct rigorous follow-up studies. And that's kind of the price of admission, and I think that should be an acceptable price of admission for those of us that are interested in going down this path. But I think that the overall impact here is that it could shave years off the development process and save millions and millions of dollars, if not substantially more than that, for the overall development process. Now, there was a lot of skepticism when we first began talking about the application of breakthrough therapies. A lot of people thought that, hey, this is something that the FDA is going to be very, very slow to implement. It's going to take a long time. You know, we may never really see any meaningful impact in the foreseeable future. But I'm pleased to say that, again, just in the past several weeks, we've seen numerous examples of things that are being focused on a variety of different conditions that actually show that the FDA has granted breakthrough status for these different types of therapies. And it's all data-driven. Now, does breakthrough status designation, does that mean that you're approved? No, that's not what it means. What it means is that you've been given a prioritized position, if you will, and it allows you to do some things, I think, in a more flexible manner, in a more interactive manner with the FDA. And as you can see from some of the numbers here, in terms of the size of the studies by which the determination has actually been made, in most instances, we're not really talking about enormous sized studies here. This one's a little bit deceptive because it's one study that was listed as a phase 1. It's the only phase 1 that I know of where there were 1,000 patients actually listed as part of the study. But the point is that it's really 5 studies in one. And the point is that you can see that it cuts across a range of different either ultra-rare orphan indications or cancer or infectious diseases. And so I think this is a good sign that the FDA is really thinking about the broad application of how this new paradigm is going to go into effect. But as I mentioned, what it does is it sets up a discussion that we as a community need to have about how are we going to tie this to rethinking about the reimbursement mechanisms that exist today and how we can actually bring these things together so that we don't end up achieving clinical success and then have no place to go, or at least no place to go anytime soon. And so for that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
All right. Thanks, Gil. Good morning, everybody. And Gil asked me to sort of tag team with him on this panel because, number one, it is things that we're talking about within the confines of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, but also because Tom referred to sort of my day job. This is my day job, is to help companies in this space think through a lot of these issues. And certainly the accelerated approval process and the breakthrough therapy designation process that was created in PDUFA was a tremendously exciting development. But it is important to tie it back to reimbursement strategies for companies because, as Gil said, I mean, you don't want to be in a situation where that's great, we got through the FDA really quickly, and now we've sort of got several years before we can figure out if we're actually going to get paid for our product. So just a couple of overarching principles when you're thinking about reimbursement. So I'm going to talk about reimbursement sort of generally and then tie it to what you need to do in this new construct. Because the principles are the same, it's only your strategy that's a little bit different. So the principles basically, you always have to address the 3 sort of pillars: coding, coverage, and payment. You all know regenerative medicine therapies have some unique issues because the novelty of the technology, so a lot of payers are still sort of getting used to the technology in the same way the FDA is trying to get used to the technology, and also because they might be very expensive. And last but not least, we're talking about a different paradigm in medicine, right? We're not talking about medicine that you might take over the next 20 years for a chronic disease. We're potentially talking about one administration, maybe a handful of administrations in some cases, that actually cure a disease. So that has, a very different kind of set of expectations and variables. So reimbursement is tied to FDA approval in the US, right? Unless you're in a situation where you're getting reimbursed for a product in a clinical trial, which is a whole separate thing, you need to have FDA approval before you can be reimbursed, but the timetable is not the same. So it doesn't mean that Medicare or private insurers are sort of walking down the road with you at FDA, but they are going to wait for you to get that FDA approval. So what that really means is you have to start early in your clinical program, start thinking about reimbursement, and tie it to your clinical strategy. So what does that mean? What does reimbursement planning look like? Well, a couple of things. First of all, needless to say, you really have to understand the product that you're developing, but that means sort of everything about it, the indication, the site of service, the formulation, all of those things, because they're all going to be variables that will affect the way your product is paid for. And again, I'm talking about in the US here. You need to know the reimbursement process. So I just listed a couple of basic points. So there's a whole coding process, right? CPT codes are for physician services. So-called HCPCS codes are for everything that's basically not a physician or a hospital service, like a drug or a biologic. There's a coverage process, which is either where you're talking about Medicare or you're talking about private insurers. There's a whole process by which the insurer determines whether your product is covered under their insurance plan, which is separate from whether there's a code, i.e. whether a doctor will be paid if they use the product or prescribe the product. And it's also different from payment, as in how much money you're going to get for your product and a doctor's going to get or a hospital's going to get. And payment, again, is based on site of service. If a product is used in a hospital inpatient procedure, if it's administered in a physician's office, those are completely different payment systems with completely different rules. And then in the US, we're now thinking of all these new reimbursement systems, right? We're talking about, now we're talking about cost effectiveness, we're talking about comparative effectiveness, we're talking about bundling payments, as in, a patient goes into a hospital with a particular, presents with a particular set of symptoms or indications, and maybe we should be reimbursing for the whole suite of services they get, the hospital care, the physician care, and all the drugs that they get in the hospital or maybe post-discharge. That has implications for how much you're going to get paid for your product. And then finally, as I mentioned, the timetable for reimbursement is very different. So all of these things, the coding, the coverage, the payment, they all operate independently with their own time frames, their own timetables, and their own set of actors, right? If we wanted to make it more complicated, we couldn't. But that is the reality, at least for now, in the US. So again, you have to start really early, and the next couple of slides are the questions that you need to ask, and some of it is what we've just talked about. So where will the product be administered? Who's the customer, right? Is it a doctor? Is it hospitals? Is it specialty pharmacies? What population will get the product? If you're talking about a product that you think is for people over age 65, or at least in part for people over age 65, then CMS is going to want to know that you've enrolled, for example, people over 65 in your clinical trials. So you'd be able to tell them, this is how my product works for people who are older, right? If you have a pediatric population, it's not necessary to do that. So you really have to know your patient population. Some other issues. Is your product unique, or are there similar products? Can you learn anything from the way similar products are paid for, are coded? Do you need to get a different code, or can physicians use the existing code to administer your product? What clinical evidence do you have? Medicare, private insurers in the US, they're all about clinical benefit. They want to see that you really can demonstrate clinical benefit for your product. And they will have their own definition of what clinical benefit means, which may not be the same as FDA's definition of what safe and effectiveness means, right? So it's a parallel system. So this is what I call the reimbursement checklist for a CEO. You need to do an analysis where you think through all of those issues, right? And you figure out, okay, I've thought through all of those issues, now I need to come up with my strategy. Be great if you did that in phase 2, but you absolutely have to do it before phase 3. Otherwise, you're going to get through the FDA, hopefully, and then an insurance company or Medicare is going to say to you, well, that's great, but this data does not tell us what we need to know when we make our payment decision and our coverage decision. And so you're going to have to go back and do additional studies. And and those studies, of course, will not be reimbursed by anybody. So you really, really need to get this done early in your development process. Securing a meeting with CMS for Medicare or private insurers or both is really, really important, because you want to sit down with them and say, this is my technology, these are the patients, right? All those questions, this is where it's going to be administered, this is the site of service, this is who we're going to treat, this is the preliminary data we have, because the insurance company and their medical directors, all this technology is very new to them too. And just like with the FDA, if they don't understand it and they don't feel comfortable with it, they're going to struggle to give you adequate reimbursement and to work with you to try to get your product covered. So you need to talk to them, because you also need to find out what data they are looking for. So if you've got a product for a particular disease, they're going to say, well, how does your data stack up against other products that are on the market or currently available treatments, right? Or what the standard of care is now? How long are you prepared to follow your patients? How long do you think the clinical effectiveness of your product will last? They're going to ask you all those kinds of questions, because that's how they're going to think about this. They're going to have to decide if your product is worth paying for, right? Which is, again, a very different analysis than what FDA is looking at. So meeting with insurers early is really, really important thing to do. Okay? Gathering health economic and comparative effectiveness data is going to be important. If you meet with the insurance companies, that's what they're going to tell you to do. Right? So you can say to them, not only is my product show clinical benefit, but it's more cost effective than the current standard of care. And then lastly, you want to build relationships with physicians and with patient advocacy groups. Those people are going to be your surrogate advocates with insurers, certainly with FDA, of course, but with insurers as well. Because if you can create a little market demand amongst the clinical community and the patient community, that's going to help you when you're talking to the insurers about whether they should pay for your product. And as a practical matter, when you're talking about coding, the coding system is run by the American Medical Association, which means that you need to make sure that you've got physicians within the American Medical Association structure who are advocating for your product, who are saying, you know what, I'm a cardiologist and I'm telling you this is the best product to treat patients with heart disease. It's better than all the other products I've ever used. There needs to be a code for this. This needs to be reimbursed. You're going to need doctors to say that, because just you saying it isn't going to be enough. So building relationships with doctors and patient groups is key. So now let's put all that in the context of accelerated approval and breakthrough therapies like Gil was talking about. So instead of now, 10 years, 15 years of a clinical program where you have time to sort of navigate all this reimbursement stuff, now suddenly your time is shrunk, which is a good thing. So that means if you're thinking about accelerated approval and you haven't talked to Medicare yet, if you haven't talked to insurance company medical directors yet, that's what you need to do, at the break, right? You need to do that now, because you have a very short window, which is a good thing, when your product is going to get on the market. So you need to plan early. You need to get out there and meet with the insurance medical directors and CMS so they understand your product, so they understand that it's coming really soon, right? It's coming soon. Patients are going to, this is what you're going to say. It's coming soon. Patients are going to want this. Doctors are going to want this. You in the insurance world need to get up to speed on this technology, right? You're going to want to have those relationships. You're going to want to make sure you've got key opinion leaders in the physician and patient community, because you're going to have to build support for this program really, really quickly. So, to my mind, the accelerated approval and breakthrough therapy programs don't really change your reimbursement strategy. You still have to go through all of those steps, but you just have a very limited window to do it, which means you need to be very aggressive and start planning and doing it very, very early in your clinical program. So if you're thinking about applying for the status of breakthrough therapy or accelerated approval, and you haven't thought about reimbursement, you need to do that right away. So I'll turn it back to Gil to wrap up.
So, and actually, one of the points that Michael just made, so as you're making your argument to third-party payers, one, it's important to understand the priorities and objectives of your audience, but I think it's also important, and I think we as a community can actually make a point in a way that traditionally larger companies or the traditional biopharma sector, if you will, has really shied away from making, which is, if we construct our trials the right way and we're willing to make the argument that shows how we can reduce hospitalization times and other forms of very expensive interventional care, we can actually make a value proposition to them. We can actually say, look, we're going to shift the cost curve in the right direction, which is something that we know that each one of the third parties care deeply about, even if they are not allowed in many instances to explicitly include that in their calculus about what the reimbursement point is going to make.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and I just wanted to add, so you absolutely want to be able to make that value argument, which is why you need to talk to them about what kind of pharmacoeconomic data they want to see, so that it can be an iterative process. But it's also, that does not mean that, you know, they're not going to pay for a very expensive product, or that, you know, a product that, you know, might not be able to meet that kind of high standard in terms of pharmacoeconomics and value. But if you have a product where you're not going to be able to demonstrate that, like really reductions in hospitalizations or something like that, or you think your data is going to be a little bit fuzzy on that, then you really have to have significant clinical benefit. And if you have really significant clinical benefit, you can go, don't forget, the people in the insurance world, a lot of whom are making these decisions, are physicians, they're medical directors. They will, you know, they'll respond to the fact that you're doing great things for patients, and that physicians in their community are telling them that you're going to do great things for patients, right? That's why you want to have the physician support. So I'm not suggesting that even if you can't show, for example, that you can reduce hospitalizations, that forget it, you're kind of dead in the water. That's a great argument to be able to make, and you want to be in a position to make it. But even if you can't, if you can demonstrate real clinical benefit, then you've still got a really good argument to make before the payers, and they will respond to that.
Yeah. And just one thing that's actually tied to that concept. So I believe that the time is right for a major initiative in regenerative medicine. For those of you that have followed some of the blogs I've written and some of the other things that I've talked about in the past, I really believe that we've reached a critical inflection point, and that the time is right for us to make, not just in the U.S., but actually internationally, an investment that will actually give birth to what I think of as the regenerative medicine equivalent of the Human Genome Project, except with a much larger strategic payoff. Because I think that what we can do is we can actually utilize our collective resources and activities to demonstrate just how we can improve clinical care, enhance patient quality of life, and shift the cost curve in the right direction. And I think looking at an example like what Tom was talking about, stroke. So we have a program in stroke as well. The last time that somebody actually published a reasonably informed paper on the healthcare economic or pharmacoeconomic benefits related or cost impact related to stroke was the American Heart Association paper, which I think was published back in 1998, which used 1995 or 1994 data, which showed even back then that the cumulative cost of downstream care for a stroke patient is hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Well, the NHS here, the National Center for Health Statistics in the United States, and other corresponding organizations at geographic locations and countries that are interested in this should actually be conducting those types of analyses for the benefit of the entire community. We as taxpayers and as citizens, we're paying for all that data, right? So why not give us access to it so that we can actually say, hey, we know that the long-term cost burden or clinical burden for these types of indications is as follows. Right? Then we can actually use that as a way to create models and actually make more informed one, it will help us design our clinical trials more effectively, as Tom was actually alluding to earlier. But number two, it will actually help us begin to make that value proposition in a way that historically we've really not been able to make it. And ultimately, I think that's in everybody's best interest. So that is something that we as a community, through organizations like the Alliance and through our sister organization over here, AAT, can work together to actually see that implemented. And I think we should be doing it. So, again, there's some very exciting initiatives. Didn't really get to talk much about the announcement out of Japan about what they're doing there. But again, I think it reflects the belief and the collective growing confidence about the transformational potential of regenerative medicine and what it might mean. There's a lot of really good things going on over here in the UK. What's going on around the Catapult project and corresponding initiatives I think are tremendously exciting. As Michael was saying, it's never too early to begin planning, to begin thinking about how you're going to incorporate these types of issues into your development plan and really be thinking about how you can design certain elements into your clinical trial plan. So hopefully you will all support the concept of this vision around a major international initiative, and certainly I'd love to talk to you about that if time permits. But with that, I think we've covered all the issues, and thank you very much.